Chapter 3: The USA versus URSS Rivalry under Kennedy. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a pivotal moment in Cold War history, took place in October 1962 and brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. Here are the key events and dynamics of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba, overthrowing the U.S.-backed regime of Fulgencio Batista and establishing a socialist government with close ties to the Soviet Union. In April 1961, the U.S. attempted to overthrow Castro with the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed covert operation by Cuban exiles supported by the CIA. The United States had deployed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey, near the Soviet border, in 1961. This was seen by the Soviets as a threat and contributed to the Cold War tensions. In response to the perceived threat and to counter the U.S. advantage, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. In October 1962, U.S. reconnaissance flights discovered evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing a naval blockade to prevent further shipments. The U.S. established a naval blockade, termed a quarantine, around Cuba to prevent Soviet ships from delivering more missiles. The crisis led to intense diplomatic negotiations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Messages were exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev, both privately and publicly. Kennedy formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, a group of advisors to discuss and manage the crisis. In a secret agreement, the U.S. agreed to dismantle its Jupiter missiles in Turkey, and the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, officially resolving the crisis. The U.S. also pledged not to invade Cuba. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. and the Soviet Union established a direct hotline to facilitate communication. The crisis also contributed to the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often considered the closest the world has come to nuclear war. It highlighted the need for direct communication between superpowers and the dangers of brinkmanship in international relations. The crisis had a profound impact on subsequent U.S.-Soviet relations and shaped Cold War diplomacy. The Bay of Pigs invasion occurred during the early months of President John F. Kennedy's administration, specifically in April 1961. While the planning and initial preparations were set in motion during the Eisenhower era, Kennedy inherited the operation upon taking office in January 1961. Here are the key details of the Bay of Pigs invasion under Kennedy's presidency. The initial planning for the invasion began under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who authorized the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to organize and train Cuban exiles for an invasion of Cuba. Kennedy assumed the presidency on January 20, 1961, and inherited the ongoing preparations for the invasion. Kennedy faced a difficult decision regarding whether to proceed with the invasion as planned or to modify or cancel the operation. Initially, Kennedy was cautious and skeptical about the plan but eventually approved it with some modifications. Kennedy made significant changes to the original invasion plan. He reduced the number of airstrikes, fearing that overt U.S. involvement could escalate the conflict and damage the reputation of the United States. The reduction in air support had a critical impact on the success of the invasion. One of the most consequential decisions made by Kennedy was the cancellation of air support for the invading forces. This decision left the Cuban exiles vulnerable to Cuban military resistance. The invasion began on April 15, 1961, with Cuban exiles landing at the Bay of Pigs. The lack of air cover, combined with strong Cuban resistance, led to the failure of the invasion within days. The invading force was captured or killed, and the operation was widely seen as a fiasco. The Bay of Pigs invasion had significant international repercussions. It strained U.S.-Cuban relations and led to increased tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. President Kennedy took responsibility for the failure of the invasion. In a press conference, he stated, "There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan." The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion prompted Kennedy to re-evaluate U.S. policy toward Cuba and the broader strategy of containing communism in Latin America. The Bay of Pigs invasion contributed to the souring of U.S.-Cuban relations and laid the groundwork for the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The perceived U.S. aggression in the Bay of Pigs increased Cuba's reliance on the Soviet Union for protection. The Bay of Pigs invasion under Kennedy's presidency became a significant early challenge for his administration and highlighted the complexities of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. The experience had lasting implications for Kennedy's approach to future Cold War crises. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union during John F. Kennedy's presidency, 1961 to 1963, was a critical period in the Cold War. Kennedy faced several challenges and confrontations with the Soviet Union, and the dynamics between the two superpowers shaped the global geopolitical landscape. Here are key aspects of the USA-USSR relations during Kennedy's presidency. In June 1961, Kennedy met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. The summit was marked by intense discussions and revealed significant differences between the two leaders on issues such as the status of West Berlin. In August 1961, the Soviet Union, in collaboration with East Germany, began constructing the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier separating East and West Berlin. This event heightened tensions and symbolized the division of the city. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 was a critical moment of confrontation. The U.S. discovered Soviet ballistic missiles in Cuba, leading to a 13-day standoff. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade, demanding the removal of the missiles. The crisis was defused through diplomacy, with both sides agreeing to dismantle certain missile installations. In August 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. This marked a step toward arms control. The space race continued during Kennedy's presidency. The Soviet Union had achieved early milestones with the launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, and the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin. Kennedy responded by setting the goal of landing an American on the moon before the end of the decade. Kennedy implemented the flexible response doctrine, which aimed to provide a range of military options to address different levels of conflict. This strategy contrasted with the previous emphasis on massive retaliation. In June 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union established a direct communications link known as the Hotline between the White House and the Kremlin. This was intended to facilitate quick communication during times of crisis. The arms race continued, with both the U.S. and the Soviet Union building up their nuclear arsenals. The Kennedy administration focused on improving the U.S. nuclear capability to maintain a credible deterrent. The United States aimed to counter Soviet influence in Latin America through the Alliance for Progress, a program that provided economic aid and development assistance to promote stability and prevent the spread of communism in the region. Despite the tensions, Kennedy articulated a vision for peace and nuclear disarmament in speeches such as the Strategy of Peace at American University in June 1963. He emphasized the need for coexistence and diplomatic solutions. The USA-USSR relations during Kennedy's presidency were marked by a mixture of confrontation and attempts at cooperation. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a particularly critical moment that tested the leadership of both Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Limited Test Ban Treaty and the establishment of the Hotline were positive steps toward reducing the risk of nuclear conflict. Kennedy's tragic assassination in 1963 left his vision for peace and coexistence as part of his lasting legacy.